I almost did not get on that boat. The grant letter came on a Tuesday. 3 words that ended everything. Proposal not accepted. 3 years of field work, 200 dried specimens, 1 very dead orchid I had been nursing since grad school. All of it stacked up and quietly rejected by a committee of people who had probably never touched actual soil in their lives. By Thursday, I was standing on a rain-slicked boarding dock in Seattle with a carry-on bag and a last-minute cruise ticket Nora had basically forced into my hand. "You need water," she told me. Not the greenhouse kind. The ship was loud in the way that expensive things sometimes are. All polished surfaces and people performing relaxation. I found the bar fast. The autumn wind off the Pacific had already worked through my jacket, and I stood there in damp blonde hair and worse mood, scanning for an empty seat. There was one. A woman in a black leather jacket was half occupying the bar stool next to it, her arm resting across the back like she had claimed the whole territory. I sat down anyway. She looked at me sideways. Green eyes, sharp and unhurried. Her left arm was a full sleeve of ink, botanical in style, dense with leaves and winding stems that disappeared under her cuff. I recognized the central image before I recognized her face. Passiflora incarnata. "Drawn wrong. That vine," I said, before I had made any decision to speak. The tendrils curl the wrong direction. She looked at her own arm with a patience that suggested she was used to being talked to by strangers and did not particularly mind it. Most people lead with hello. Most people do not have incorrect botany on their arm. She smiled then, slow and sideways, and told me her name was Camila. I told her mine. We argued about the vine for 20 minutes. And she never once conceded the point, even when I was right, which I was. The bartender refilled our drinks without being asked. Later we ended up on the outer deck. The sky had gone that deep bruised purple that only happens over open water in October, and Camila was pointing out a constellation I already knew, leaning close enough that her black hair caught the wind and crossed into my space. I did not move back. Neither did she. The distance between us simply ran out. Her lips were warm against the cold air, and the kiss was brief and unhurried all at once, lasting exactly long enough to confirm that it was not accidental. I pulled back first. The ship moved beneath us with a slow, deliberate roll, like it was making a point. I looked at her. She looked at me. Neither of us said anything clever. 3 days later, we docked and traded numbers on a receipt from the bar. Camila wrote hers out twice, scratching over the first attempt with a steadiness that did not quite hold. I noticed. I did not mention it. Back in Boise, I pinned that receipt to the greenhouse wall between a pressed fern cutting and a humidity chart. Told myself it was clutter. Left it there anyway. Boise is not a small city. I had told myself that approximately 11 times before I found out Camila's studio was 4 blocks from my lab. 4 blocks. I could throw a specimen jar and probably hit the sign. I started walking the long way to campus, cutting through the park, adding 8 minutes to a commute I already resented. It worked fine until a Tuesday afternoon when my feet apparently made their own decision, and I ended up standing on the sidewalk outside a storefront called King Ink, watching Camila through the glass. She was laughing at something, her client said, head tilted back, completely unbothered by the world. She looked like a person who had never once walked 8 minutes out of her way to avoid anything. I turned around and walked home fast, like I had been caught stealing something. It was Nora who pushed me through the door eventually. She showed up at the greenhouse on a Wednesday with coffee, and that particular expression she wears when she has already decided something on my behalf. "Book the appointment," she said. "I do not want a tattoo. You have been talking about that fern for 2 years. Put it somewhere permanent." She was not wrong about the fern. Densitatia punctilobula, a species I had documented during fieldwork in the Smokies, delicate and overlooked and quietly resilient. I booked the appointment under my last name and told myself Camila would not remember me. She remembered me immediately. The session was 2 hours in a chair that was more comfortable than it looked. Camilla working with a concentration that made the room feel smaller and warmer. We talk the way people talk when one of them cannot move, and the other has a reason to stay close. Art and science and the specific loneliness of being very good at something most people do not understand. Her hands were steady and certain in a way that made it hard to look anywhere else. When she finished, she set her tools down and studied the design without touching it. The way I look at a rare specimen before deciding whether to press it or leave it alive. She walked me to the door. The street outside was loud with early evening traffic, and neither of us acknowledged it. Then she kissed me in the doorway with a quiet certainty that had no hesitation in it whatsoever, her hand light at my jaw, the autumn air cold against my neck. I stepped back onto the sidewalk, and the noise of the street came back all at once. I looked at her. She leaned in the doorframe like she lived there. I walked home the short way. What I did not know yet, what none of us knew, was that inside the studio Dante was already fielding calls from a private number, a woman with a composed voice and very specific requests, asking about Camilla by name. Dante wrote the name down on a sticky note and stuck it to the register. Sloane Whitfield. He did not like the way it felt in the room. Neither would I. Camilla showed up at the greenhouse on a Friday night with no real explanation. Just a text that said she was in the neighborhood, which was not possible because nobody is in the neighborhood of a university plant lab at 9 p.m. by accident. I let her in anyway. She moved through the space the way she moved through most things, unhurried, taking it all in without asking permission. The hanging ferns, the humidity monitors, the rows of labeled specimens under grow lights. I watched her look at everything and felt something I was not prepared to name, the particular exposure of having someone see the place where you are most yourself. She stopped at a flowering epidendrum and pulled out her phone. "Ask me before you photograph my work," I said. She lowered the phone, looked at me directly. It is the most honest thing I have seen in years. I did not have an answer for that. I went back to my notes. We ended up sitting on the floor between two planting beds, which was not something I had planned or would have predicted, drinking cold coffee from my thermos and talking in the particular way that happens late at night when the professional distance is worn through. I told her about the grant, the 3 years and the rejected proposal, and the orchid I had carried onto that ship like a patient I could not save. She listened without filling the silence, which is rarer than people think. Then, she told me about the years before Boise. City after city. A studio here, a sublet there, never staying long enough for anything to matter. She said it plainly, without asking for sympathy, just information. This is what I am. The greenhouse was warm and smelled of damp earth and green growing things. Somewhere in the middle of a sentence about root systems, I became aware that we had both stopped talking. Camilla reached over and pushed a strand of blonde hair back from my face, one simple deliberate movement, and then neither of us moved for a long beat. When we finally came together, it was slow and certain, a kiss that had no urgency in it because it did not need any. Her hand stayed light at the side of my face. I kept my eyes closed a moment after it ended, listening to the hum of the grow lights. I thought, this is what it feels like when something actually takes root. Monday came and cracked it open. Camilla canceled our plans that evening with 2 sentences and no reason given. I read the message 4 times looking for information that was not there. I wrote back fine and meant the opposite, and she knew it and said nothing further. What I did not know was that Sloane Whitfield had walked into King Ink that morning, composed and unhurried, dropping references to old financial pressure points with the casual precision of someone who had done research. Camilla stood behind her own counter in her own studio and felt the floor shift slightly. She showed nothing. She was very good at showing nothing. But she canceled on me. And the silence that opened between us after that felt less like a pause and more like weather coming in. Nora found everything in under 48 hours. That is the thing about having a librarian for a best friend. She does not gossip. She researches. She laid it out over breakfast. No drama. Just facts delivered in her flat, precise way. Sloane Whitfield, 29. daughter of Raymond Whitfield, whose development company had quietly gutted a 3-block stretch of Boise's east side 4 years ago. Small businesses displaced, leases terminated, buildings gutted and flipped. The previous tenant of Camila's current studio space had been among them, a ceramics collective that had operated there for 11 years, gone in a single quarter. Sloan had been circling Camila's world ever since. The reasons were personal and calculated in equal measure, the way certain people pursue things they cannot simply purchase. I sat with my coffee and asked the only question that mattered. Did Camila know who she was? Nora looked at me. That is what you need to find out. I found Camila outside the studio at 7 that evening. The first winter sleet had arrived, coming down sideways off the foothills, the kind of cold that has an opinion about you. She was locking up, and she saw me coming and did not pretend otherwise. What followed was not elegant. I asked whether she had known about Sloane's connection to the displacement, to this building, to the deliberate pressure she was applying. Camila answered in pieces, defensive and incomplete, and I was listening too hard for the wrong things. We were both translating fear into language it did not quite fit. This is exactly why I never stay anywhere, she said. Her green eyes were steady, but her jaw was tight. Maybe you had the right idea, I said back. It landed the way I knew it would. We separated at the corner, walking opposite directions down a wet, empty street, the sleet indifferent to both of us. Boise felt enormous and badly lit. I got home and stood in my kitchen for a long time not making tea. What I did not know was happening simultaneously across the city. Dante had stayed late at the studio running end-of-month numbers when he heard Sloan on her phone in the consultation room, a door she had not closed completely. Names, dates, a city council contact, the studio property flagged in a development portfolio that had nothing to do with tattoos and everything to do with a project her family company had been advancing quietly for 8 months. The personal obsession and the business motive were the same single move. Dante called Camila immediately. She picked up on the second ring and listened without speaking for most of it. When he finished, she sat in her car in the dark for a while, thinking about root systems and greenhouses and things she had said on a wet corner that she could not take back. She drove to my building, sat outside for 20 minutes watching the lit window of my apartment. Then she drove away. I watched her taillights from behind the curtain and did not go down. Neither of us was ready yet, but the silence between us had changed shape, and I felt it even then, less like an ending and more like a held breath. 3 weeks of silence is long enough to convince yourself you are fine and short enough that you are clearly not. I filled the time with work, which is what I always do. Grant paperwork, specimen cataloging, a departmental meeting that could have been an email. I did not walk past King Ink. I did not check Camila's social pages more than twice a day, which I considered a personal victory. The shelter volunteer day had been on my calendar since September. Boise Foothills Animal Shelter, winter intake event, 8 in the morning. I almost canceled. I went anyway because backing out of commitments is not something I do, and because Nora told me the fresh air would fix me, and because I had run out of reasons to stay in the greenhouse feeling sorry for myself. Camila was already there when I arrived. She was in the dog wing, moving between kennels with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, a terrier mix following her progress from behind the gate with single-minded devotion. She looked up when I walked in. Neither of us performed surprise. We had both signed up months ago, and we both knew it, and we stood there for a moment in the particular awkwardness of two people who have said damaging things and not yet found the way back through them. Then a shelter coordinator handed me a leash and put me to work, and we spent 4 hours side by side without addressing any of it directly. The terrier, scruffy and relentless, attached itself to me sometime around 10 and did not leave my side for the rest of the morning. Camila watched this from 2 kennels over. "She has good taste," she said finally. I did not smile. I almost did. Then the door opened, and the temperature in the room changed. Sloane Whitfield walked into the shelter lobby like she had been invited, composed, and out of place in a coat that cost more than my monthly utilities. She had seen Camilla's post about the volunteer day. She crossed to us with manufactured warmth and turned to me directly, her voice carrying just enough to be deliberate. "You seem like someone she passes through," Sloane said pleasantly. "She does that." The lobby went quiet in that specific way that precedes something irreversible. Then the front door opened again and Dante walked in, not by coincidence, with a folder of printed documentation and the expression of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment. He said Sloane's name once, clearly, and held up the development contracts. What followed was brief and decisive. Sloane's composure developed a visible crack along the edge, the first real one I had seen. She left without theater, just a retreating figure through the glass door, her reflection splitting across the frame. The lobby emptied slowly. I sat down on the floor of the dog wing, back against the wall, the terrier immediately in my lap. Camilla crouched down across from me and was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had been doing the math on every wrong choice she had made, and I was not one of them. No theater, no qualification. Just the plain truth delivered directly. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I set the terrier gently aside and closed the distance myself this time. The kiss landed like a decision I had already made 3 weeks ago and was only now catching up to. Camilla exhaled slowly against my mouth, the tension leaving her all at once, and we stayed there until the terrier climbed back into both our laps and made further conversation impossible. I looked down at her and then at Camilla. "Her name is Fern," I said. Camilla did not argue with that. The development story broke on a Wednesday morning. Local outlet first, then picked up wider by Thursday. Raymond Whitfield's company lost the city council backing by Friday afternoon. 3 votes pulled in a single session. The project was dead. Sloane's number went inactive sometime over the weekend, her social presence quietly scrubbed, her name already becoming past tense in the way that certain people manage when consequences arrive. Camilla called me when it was over. Not to celebrate. Just to tell me first. I was already walking to the studio when she called. I had booked the second appointment myself, 2 days earlier, choosing the design alone in the greenhouse at midnight with Fern asleep on my feet. The rare orchid. Passiflora incarnata had started it all, but this was the one that mattered. The specimen I had carried in my bag onto a rain-slicked dock in Seattle when everything had fallen apart. The Grant flower. The one I had not been able to save. I sat down in Camilla's chair and told her where I wanted it. Somewhere visible. Somewhere I could not pretend it was not there. She worked in her particular silence, steady and certain, and the studio smelled of ink and the faint pine of the winter air coming under the door. We did not need to fill the quiet. That was new, the ease of it, the way the room felt like somewhere I had always been allowed to be. When she set her tools down and leaned back to look at the finished piece, her green eyes did that thing where they went very still and very warm at the same time. She leaned in, and I met her halfway, and the kiss was easy in the way that none of the others had quite managed, unhurried and certain, the kind that comes from having already survived the worst version of things together. Through the studio window, I caught a peripheral flash of Nora's blonde head pressed against the glass, thumb raised to an empty street. I laughed against Camilla's mouth. "She followed you," Camilla said. "She follows everyone. It is how she loves people." It is full winter now in Boise. Snow settled over the foothills, and the city gone quiet under it. The greenhouse runs warm against the cold outside, grow lights humming their steady note, the rare orchid project funded at last. The grant letter arriving on a Tuesday with 2 words that undid 3 years of silence. Proposal accepted. Camilla has a stool in the corner between the fern specimens and the humidity monitor. She brings coffee every morning, asks questions that are better than most people's answers, sketches in her book while I work. We argue about the scientific accuracy of leaf curvature in her botanical sleeve designs, and she loses and does not concede, and I have stopped expecting her to. Fern is asleep by the heating vent. 1 ear up, 1 ear down, dreaming whatever terriers dream. I look at the orchid on my arm sometimes, at the tendrils Camila drew curling in exactly the right direction, and I think about what I told my students last semester about the rare species. They do not survive by accident. They survive by finding the precise conditions that allow them to. The right soil, the right light, the right season. I almost did not get on that boat. I think about that too.